Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this video, I'm going to be taking as my centerpiece the full moon in Pisces, which takes place on the 20th, 21st of September, depends where you are in the world. And I'm going to be looking at that in the context of everything else that's going on in this kind of 10-day, 2-week period. So let's look first of all at this full moon in Pisces. Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac, and it is said that Pisces contains the whole of the zodiac's experience within it. It's also called the dustbin of the zodiac, but either way, it means there's a lot of wisdom and experience and all sorts of things wrapped up in this sign, which is why it's such a complex and kind of difficult sign to really get a hold of. So the moon in Pisces puts the moon, which of course has no light of its own. It's only, or we only see it because it's reflected in the sun's light. That principle really of reflection, of memories, of dreams, of inspirations and recollections is really bound up in this full moon. It's a time when people will be talking about the past, talking about their recent experience and processing it. And, you know, we've all got Pisces in our charts somewhere. We may know exactly where that is, and it means that the house that Pisces governs is going to be the area where we're going to really experience the focus of this full moon. For instance, this forthcoming full moon is in my 5th house, and that's a very creative, self-oriented, actually quite joyous and pleasurable part of the zodiac. So maybe I'm going to have a lot of fun in my dreams, or maybe a lot of my recollections are going to be very joyous. But it's also a time, maybe because there will be things to reflect on in terms of my offspring and my creative endeavors, which of course include all my recent books. So you see how you can play around with what you know to be the area of your horoscope that the moon falls in. Now with Pisces, the moon in Pisces, what themes are we looking at? Well, we're looking at inspiration, which I just mentioned. We're looking at compassion. We're looking at selflessness. We're looking at soul connection. We're looking at divine inspiration and those moments where we really do feel we've got a glimpse of something that's very true and meaningful. Moon in Pisces can give us that moment. But there is always an opposite side, or an underbelly, as I often call it, to any one sign, any planet, any influence in a chart. And when you look at Pisces, you get deception and betrayal and confusion and chaos. Loss of direction, loss of your emotional and intellectual compass somehow. And that's also possible on this full moon, but at least having the benefit of a heads up from me, you'll know what happens if you start to lose the plot, or you seem to really be in a kind of mire of things that don't seem to be very real and are giving you all sorts of anxieties. Now, this full moon, the degree of the full moon is 28 degrees of Pisces and 13 minutes actually, and that is close to the fixed star sheet. Now, this is part of Pegasus, and all the fixed stars in this area of this constellation do come with a bit of a reputation. And I was thinking a little while, should I give you a list of all the things that this fixed star is known for? And I thought, no, I'm not going to scare the pants off you. But what did strike me as amusing or interesting, intriguing, was the fact that Pegasus is a horse. And if we are in the realm of dreams and imagination, well, maybe we could also throw nightmares into that as well. This full moon too, I think, coming as it does at the end of its 6-month cycle, a cycle which began with the new moon in Pisces on the 13th of March, means that something needs to be closed. We need to find closure and completion at this time, especially with projects that were begun in the middle of March, around that period of time, or things that have been running for about 6 months, and maybe we've got through a lot with them and we feel we've got to a point where we may be able to go further, or we've got to a pit stop, or maybe a stopping point. Whatever it was is really done and dusted. And I often put relationships into this as well, because if we meet somebody on a new moon, or 6 months later, we'll have a full moon at that same sign. And that will give us an idea where that relationship has taken us. I mean, it might have petered out before then. On the other hand, you might be at a make or break point with that 6-month relationship. So these two things are in fact connected. So now let's take a look at what this full moon looks like when it's in a horoscope. So as you'll see with this full moon, I've taken it from the perspective of London because actually it again shows us very clearly the sun at the very bottom of the chart by that arrow at the base, and the moon up there at the very top of the chart. And we can see that mostly all those planets are contained in half the horoscope. Now, this is very interesting because if you've got people born at this time, and they will have this configuration in their charts, this particular shaping, it's the kind of shaping that goes with people that feel they have a lot to offer the world. They'll take in their experience and their knowledge, and they'll want to pour it out on the world. And there's a sense of mission often with people with a bold shaping. But if we look and think in terms of what's going on in the sky on a day-to-day basis in terms of what happens to us, we can see that there's a lot going on, and it's a bit lopsided. We've got a lot of things that seem to occupy our attention all the time, and we're not doing a lot of other things. They're getting a bit left by the wayside. And of course, we need to find that balance. Again, it's going to be different for each of us. Some of us may find we're focusing a lot on work. There's a lot of things that are taking us out in the world, being very out there. And what we've neglected, or what needs to be back in balance, really is our private life, our personal life, our home and family. And in a way, all full moons are about balance at some level. Yes, they're about closure and completion, but they're also about the polarity between the sun and the moon, and how we can find union, that midway point, that compromise sometimes between one end of the spectrum and the other. Now, I want to draw your attention to the moon up at the very top of the chart, and you'll see it's close to Neptune, that trident image. And that's really rather important for a number of reasons. The moon is in Pisces, Neptune is in Pisces. And during the day, the 24-hour period up to the full moon, the moon will have passed over Neptune before it becomes full with its opposition to the sun. So we do have Neptune playing in to this moon in Pisces, and Neptune rules the sign of Pisces. So we have a really, really strong flavor of Neptune. So while we might want to look at that period of time, 20th, 21st of September, and think about all the things I've mentioned about Pisces and Neptune, selflessness, imagination, that sense of at oneness with people, soul to soul kind of exchanges, but also that sense of being in chaos, lots of confusion, not sure where you're going with one situation, not sure really exactly what's happening at the moment. So those are all present and expressed or symbolized by this particular full moon. But there's another reason why I want to talk about Neptune and the full moon, and that's really in the context of Neptune itself. Since almost the beginning of August, but certainly when we get to the 10th of August, when we had the first opposition to Neptune by a personal planet, and we're talking here about Venus opposing Neptune on the 10th. We went forward, and then Mercury came along on the 25th. On the 2nd of September, here comes Mars opposing Neptune. And by the 14th of September, we have the Sun opposing Neptune. So it's been what I have described before as a kind of rolling Neptune experience. And so many of the things that have happened during this time period have really played on that theme of suffering, of sacrifice, of betrayal, of deception, of selfless acts, of all sorts of things we've seen, particularly in the Afghanistan situation. We saw all of those things present. Heroic behavior by the forces in their management of the people who were desperate. And we saw suffering at such a level, it was difficult to take in. And there was loss. And there was also, at the very least, even you're leaving people behind, and people were left behind, but responsibilities were left behind. There was a betrayal of trust. So many of the themes of the time were really related, and we could see them as living principles in that in the situation with Afghanistan. And I want to come back to you for a minute, because I want to take a little pause here with the idea that I think what confuses people, especially people who really just love the sun signs and just want to know, what's going to happen to my sun sign this month or today or whatever it was, which is wonderful and interesting and fascinating. But serious astrology, when we start to take it, a little bit more in depth, it's such a huge and complex picture, and astrology is full of nuances. In other words, it's not black and white. There's all sorts of shades of this and shades of that. As I've just been explaining about Neptune and Pisces, on the one hand, there's this, and on the other hand, there's that. And I think sometimes this does get people kind of vaguely irritated with astrologers when they give so many options for something. But you've got to remember that those options are also part of a single principle. They are all related, but in different guises, in different nuances. And in a way, that's what makes astrology so rich and gives us such a variety of interpretation. And remember, everyone's experiencing the same influences at the same time, but they're not having an identikit experience. It's going to be Neptunian, it's going to be Piscean, but it's not an identikit experience. And I think that's really very important to remember. So let me come back to the chart again, because I want to point out some other things in this chart. As you'll see, there's a big red triangle, and that's actually a T-square, because what we're going to see here is Venus, first of all, squaring up to Saturn in the 7th house, which is that kind of 3 o'clock position, and it's going to square Saturn on the 17th of September. And it's then going to, if we come back to Venus at the bottom of that triangle, which is in Scorpio, it's going to oppose Uranus on the 23rd of September. But even if we concentrate on those dates and we say, these are the dates, those aspects are exact, remember, they're getting to that closeness and they're moving away from it. So we can really, really look at this whole period, I would say, from about even before the time I'm speaking to you, as having that Venus, Uranus, Saturn in the frame. And if you have planets around about 6 degrees of the fixed signs, that's Taurus and Scorpio, Aquarius and Leo, or 14 degrees of the fixed signs, the ones I've just mentioned, then you're going to really feel the effects of this particular T-square. Now, we've got Venus in there, so we're often talking about money and love and things that give us great joy and pleasure in life. And it's linked to Saturn, it's linked to Uranus. So on the one hand, when we think about Venus being love, when you put Venus with Saturn, you get longevity. And so you get the idea that it's the right time to put a relationship on a long-term footing. Saturn will give it durability. But if we're a little bit more realistic, we can't really separate Saturn out from Uranus. And Uranus is about impermanence. It's about change. It's about volatility. It's about the unusual and the unexpected. So I think if we wrap this up, in general, we're in for a period where we might go zinging around from one pole to the other with the idea that things are one thing one day and there's something else the other. And I think this may also affect us in our relationships, in that, and we all experience this kind of complex relationship we have with someone where we might love them deeply, but we can be annoyed with them and upset with them. And sometimes we can be bored with them and thinking perhaps this is about time we moved on. Whereas in fact, the bonds of love are much stronger than that. And so we do live through our upsets and our breakdowns of communication, which is what's really going along here. And I'm going to be looking at this in another way in a moment, but I certainly wanted to draw that to your attention, as we're looking at it. So let's come on to the next chart that I want to show you. This is the Ingress chart, and it's a chart that astrologers set up for the moment the sun arrives in the sign of Aries. That's the Aries Ingress, and the time the sun arrives in Libra, which is the Libra Ingress, and we get another 2, Cancer, Capricorn, at the 2 solstices. And what astrologers do with these charts is have a look, basing it on the country that we might set it for, and see if we can see trends and patterns that are going to be important. So here we are with our Ingress chart set for Washington. Now, as you'll see, Capricorn rises in this chart as the sun gets into Libra, 0 degrees Libra, 0 minutes. And that makes Saturn the ruler, and we can see Saturn is in the first house. And it's just below Pluto, which is rising to the ascendant. And so we can see this is going to be a difficult quarter for the United States. There's going to be a very serious tone to it. There's going to be all sorts of examinations and research and the uncovering of facts and truth, whether that relates to one person in particular, or whether it relates to actions that the government have taken or a certain group of people have taken. There'll be a lot of in-depth research going out and a lot of intelligence that's going to prove to be of vital importance. But I want to look up there to where the sun is, and that's in the sort of 2 o'clock position, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the chart, and it's close to the planet Mars. So we've got a Sun-Mars conjunction in the 8th house of this chart. And remember, this belongs to America because Washington is the capital, a city of America. So we look at the whole of America with this chart. So without getting into very long and laborious details about it, this is what I would say. I'll put these 2 things together for you. We've got the Sun and Mars in the 8th house. This is to do with finances, financial responsibilities, investments, banking, all sorts of things like that. It also has to do with sex. And when we move away and we look at Venus again, right on the midheaven, and Uranus at the opposite points, we're also drawn to relationships and money again. We've got a double whammy here. So we know that money and relationships and financial matters are going to be linked. For instance, there may be news of a divorce, for instance, on some high-profile person, and it is both shocking, but also money is going to be a big part of that. I tell you something else we're going to be looking at in terms of sex and money and trafficking in particular. What is going to happen during this quarter is that Ghislaine Maxwell is standing trial in the November. So a whole lot of focus is going to come on to money and sex trafficking. And of course, that's going to bring into it all sorts of other people, including Prince Andrew. So we can see that this is going to be a very, very important quarter for the things that I've just mentioned. I might also want to draw your attention to Mercury up there, just to the right of that arrow at the top. That's in the 9th house of legal matters, foreign matters, educational, academia, all those kind of things. And that is squaring Pluto exactly, because Mercury and Pluto are in square exactly on the day the sun comes into Libra. Now, this is a sense, if we put these words together, keywords, if you like, we're looking at Mercury, communication, we're looking at judgments, we're looking at Pluto, which is transformation, elimination, getting rid of stuff, changing it beyond belief. So we're looking at court judgments, judgments of one sort or another, that have important ramifications for a long way into the future. The reach of those judgments is going to be very long, a very long timeline. Again, let's come back to the Maxwell case, which is going to be heard in November. I think there are going to be some very, very, very dark and unpleasant things coming to light during that particular period of time. So let's come back to me again and see if there's a few other things I want to say. And I can see right away there is something else that is really, really important. And that is the fact that Mercury will turn retrograde on the 27th of September, the very, very end of the month. Now, as I often say, this isn't the biggest thing in the world. It happens about 4 times a year. And we're all used to the idea that suddenly we can't get from A to B in a straight line. People we can't get hold of, people don't get hold of us, we lose things. There's all sorts of things that tend to go AWOL when Mercury is retrograde. It isn't always very serious. And sometimes on a retrograde roll, we can have some very interesting experiences. We can reconnect with past times in some way, and people we've known, things that we've done in the past can make a reappearance, and sometimes that can be a beautiful thing. And certainly you should actively use this period between the 27th of September and the 18th of October, which is the time Mercury is retrograde, and use it to go over things, regroup, rethink things, reconsider, trace the dots back in order to bring them forward again. It can be very useful. But this Mercury retrograde also brought to mind something that I was talking about in my Friday Bites. Now, not every one of you will know about my Friday Bites. It's on my website, and a new article goes up every Friday. That's why it's called a Friday Bite. And in that Friday Bite, I talk about things that have happened during the week. Often it's just one thing, one really, really important thing. Sometimes it's 2 or 3. But recently, I had a look at the situation with the Taliban and the Taliban's speedy advance in order to overthrow Afghanistan, which it did in 9 days. And it was very interesting because that period, Uranus turned stationary retrograde on the 20th of August. Now, there's a bit of a difference in opinion about a stationary period. It means the planet appears not to be moving at all. Some people say a planet is stationary from the moment it reaches its maximum speed and then starts to drop off. And that can be some weeks before it actually is appearing to stand still. And you can sort of look at that and put it really on either side. You've got a period of some weeks in which the planet's power is greater, because that always happens on a stationary period. But for me, what really makes sense is the idea that when a planet isn't moving at all, then it is definitely stationary. It's not moving, it's stuck on that degree. And that's often for about 4 or 5 days only. However, I will give it a little more, and I tend to give 10 days on either side of a stationary retrograde, stationary direct situation with the planets outward from Jupiter. That means Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And it's a pretty good yardstick, and I'll explain why. Because using this idea of the 10-day period, 10 days back from the 20th, when it went stationary in August, we really had the advance of the Taliban and the taking over of Kabul on the 21st, literally within hours of that stationary retrograde moment. We then added another 10 days on to that, which brought us to the 30th. And of course, that's when all the troops had to be out of Afghanistan. So that whole Uranus stationary period was full of amazing, powerful, volatile, distressing things that totally changed the map in that period. So I'm using that as an example, which may also help you when you're looking at, how long is the stationary period? It's a pretty good yardstick to use. With Mercury, of course, you're not going to be able to go back 10 days. If you do, I think that's stretching it too far. You might want to go back a day or two at most. But normally, and certainly in my experience, living with retrograde Mercury, as we all do, then you have a little time before it goes retrograde. And we're sort of looking at that. It turns retrograde on the 27th. So the week before it turns retrograde, of trying to get all your ducks in a row. If you've got things to arrange, you've got lots of people to get together, or even one person to get together, then you want to start doing that at least a week before Mercury turns retrograde. And also trying to get things in a reasonable order. So even if you weren't able to accomplish everything you wanted to before we took a bit of a break, going backwards, a pit stop, a full stop, whatever you want to call it, you've got some way with that. But yes, as I always say with a planet turning retrograde, does it change its nature? No, it doesn't. And I talk about marinating. If you've got a piece of chicken or a fish and you stick some spices on it, yeah, it changes the flavor, but it's still a fish. It's still a piece of chicken. And it's the same with these planets. They don't suddenly become different. They just subtly change their influence slightly, just subtle. Okay, so I'm just checking my notes here to make sure that I've said everything I want to up to this point. I think we've covered pretty well everything. And so I want to wrap it up. And one of the things that I came across in this last week before I put this video together was a beautiful quote by Albert Camus, the writer. And the quote is, "In the depths of winter, I finally learned that within me lay an invincible summer." And he wrote those words. In retrospect, he wrote them in the late 1960s in an essay, but it was in, looking back on World War II, which were extremely dark hours for peoples across the world, and certainly for Camus himself. And it reminds me, of course, of what we've all been through in these last 20 months, which could be said to be a kind of winter. Lots of things haven't been vibrant and growing, and we've been restricted, and lots of very unpleasant and difficult things have happened. And it isn't as though everything suddenly went away. I mean, in some ways, it's just ongoing in different forms, but it just keeps on going. But I think the important thing to remember is that, we don't know happiness unless we've had unhappiness. It's a polarity, and polarities exist all through life, light and dark, hot and cold, life and death, and they exist very much in astrology too. So the greater our levels of despair and unhappiness and difficulty, so too can we come up to the greatest amount of happiness. And we know that these two things are connected. So if I'm speaking to you now and you are feeling life has really not what it was. And maybe you feel it'll never be the same and therefore you'll never be happy again. That's very untrue, because out of our midwinter must come the knowledge that inside us there is an invincible summer. And at some point we will know the happiness of that summer. So thank you for watching, everybody. And I look forward to being here for you in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, bye for now.